Hello, I'm Jan Ślewiński. Welcome aboard the Eastern Express, and as always, I hope you enjoy the journey. Russia's campaign to extinguish what remains of its independent civil society has entered a new and dangerous phase. Over the past several weeks, the Kremlin has intensified its assault on lawyers, journalists, human rights defenders, and organizations that have documented abuses for decades. The latest wave of designations of undesirable organizations and foreign agents is a message. Any attempt to scrutinize the state or oppose the war will be treated as a threat to national security. The state that once claimed strength through stability now governs through the fear it projects onto its own citizens. Without further ado, let's take a look at our latest report to find out more about it.
Russia has struggled with protecting human rights such as freedom of expression for decades. Nonetheless, this already poor situation has been deteriorating in the last few years. Civil society, human rights defense groups and even simple anti-war voices have all been targeted by the Russian state apparatus. Many see this crackdown as a sign that the Kremlin fears accountability. The way that Russian authorities stifle all these groups is through labeling them as undesirable or foreign agents. Any cooperation with them can lead to heavy fines or even long prison sentences.
It's returning steadily, and actually it's returning since the full-scale invasion. By returning, it's the old Soviet tool of getting dissidents, in this case anti-war, activists, also journalists.
Overall, more than 280 organizations have entered the undesirable list, and more than 1,000 entities and individuals have been declared foreign agents. High-profile cases include the Memorial Human Rights Organization and late Russian oppositionist Alexei Navalny's Anti-Corruption Foundation. What's more, Russian authorities suppress these entities by abusing anti-terror laws. International organizations are warning that with each passing month, ordinary Russians are becoming isolated from any independent information sources, and peaceful activism is being driven extinct.
And now let's zone in on the explaining portion of our show. Over the course of the year, Russian authorities have been busy cracking down on internet freedoms across the country. From banning or suppressing foreign-made social media platforms to mobile internet blackouts, here is how the Kremlin has taken control over Russia's online landscape.
Since May 2025, Russia has been regularly imposing internet shutdowns across the country at a rate of around 2,000 per month, more than the rest of the world combined had in 2024. The official reason for this sort of policy is to prevent Ukrainian drones from using cell navigation, but this is just the tip of the iceberg. To reduce the impact of these disruptions, the Russian government has been introducing a whitelist of apps and websites that can be used during the shutdown. Many, however, fear that these whitelists will become permanent and this sort of internet usage will become the norm. Observers see these shutdowns as part of a wider attempt by the Russian government to control Russia's online landscape. Over the course of the last few years, Russian authorities have been limiting the features or outright banning social media apps made by foreign countries. Instead, Russians are encouraged, or essentially forced, to use Russian-made apps, which the government has far more oversight over. What's more, a law has been introduced that has created a registry of terrorist and extremist materials that can be found online. Anyone interacting with these can be subject to fines or even prison time.
Any kind of materials, even not included to the registry, can be considered as an extremist materials. And it goes for different kind of, entities, objects.
VPNs, a traditional way of avoiding such restrictions, have also been targeted by the Russian government, which shows its growing prowess at being able to carry out online repression.
And now, as always, it's time to take a look at the issue in greater detail. So, let's begin. Russia's internal political landscape has shifted from authoritarianism to near total repression, and the pace of this transformation is accelerating. Over the past months, the Russian authorities have deepened their campaign to dismantle independent civil society, expand punitive legislation, and criminalize dissent. According to the UN Special Rapporteur on the Human Rights situation in Russia, the country is witnessing a seismic decline in fundamental freedoms, with an assault that now targets every remaining space where independent oversight once existed. The list of organizations declared undesirable has passed 280. More than 1,100 individuals and entities have been labeled as foreign agents. These designations are tools designed to isolate Russian citizens from outside information, legal assistance, and political activism. By expanding this list, the state is effectively building a comprehensive architecture of criminalization where even minimal interaction with civil society can trigger prosecution. The most recent additions to the list include long-standing organizations that operated for decades, despite political pressure. Their forced removal represents the elimination of the last institutional safeguards that protected citizens from state abuse. Alongside them are global human rights entities such as Human Rights Watch and the International Federation for Human Rights, groups whose presence once lent transparency to Russia's handling of legal cases, political trials, and war-related persecutions. The repression is not limited to institutions either. Leading human rights lawyers have been targeted through smear campaigns and criminal investigations. In October, Olga Sadovskaya of the Crew Against Torture and Elena Shachova of Citizens Watch were vilified in pro-government media. Days later, Shachova was charged with discrediting the Russian army, a charge frequently used against anti-war activists and anyone who challenges state narratives about the conflict in Ukraine. Such cases signal a broader trend. The legal system is being re-engineered to suppress any form of peaceful oversight. What is emerging is a pattern. Anti-war voices are reframed as extremist threats. Human rights defenders are labeled terrorists, and civil society becomes an enemy of the state. The strategic use of counter-terrorism legislation enables broad and severe penalties without needing evidence of violence or incitement. By collapsing the distinction between peaceful activism and extremist activity, the Kremlin expands its discretion to detain, prosecute, and silence. Behind these decisions lies a deeper political calculus. Russia's leadership understands that independent civil society poses a unique threat, not because it undermines national security, but because it challenges the state's monopoly on truth. In wartime, controlling the narrative is as essential as controlling the battlefield. Organizations that document military abuses, corruption, deportations, or civilian casualties disrupt the state's ability to present a unified story. This is why they must be removed. But repression on this scale also reveals vulnerability. A confident state does not fear lawyers who defend detainees, journalists who report local realities, or organizations that publish annual reports. The breadth of Russia's crackdown shows the opposite, a government concerned that accountability, internal or external, could weaken its control. The Kremlin strategy isolates Russian society from legal remedies and independent information. Without such mechanisms, citizens have no recourse when confronted with arbitrary detentions, political prosecutions, or forced mobilization. With civil society dismantled, the state becomes both the arbiter and the enforcer of truth. This is not merely authoritarian governance, but more so a system structured to ensure that wrongdoing cannot be exposed. The elimination of independent organizations is not an endpoint, but part of a broader process of centralizing power, suppressing dissent, and controlling the narrative around the war in Ukraine. Repression may silence voices in the short term, but the structural problems it conceals, economic stagnation, military losses, political fragmentation, remain unresolved. And now here to shed more light on the issue is Paul Goebel, Distinguished Senior Fellow at the Jamestown Foundation. Hello and welcome to Eastern Express.
Thank you for having me.
So, looking at Russia during the last year, would you say that the state of the civic society, or whatever is left of it, is becoming worse and worse with each passing day?
Well, certainly the conditions that the Russian people are living under have deteriorated in most cases. The people who live outside of the megalopolises of Moscow and St. Petersburg are doing much worse than they did before. Indeed, rising prices, falling pay, increasing hidden unemployment would drive in many countries, would lead to massive demonstrations. That hasn't been the case because Russians are afraid of punishment, and they have a long tradition of deference to the state, which has not yet been completely exhausted. At the same time, however, it is important to remember that there have been hundreds, literally hundreds, of protests of various kinds across the Russian Federation about a wide variety of issues. The big thing is, though, these are not linked up with each other, nor have they been anti-Putin. Instead, they have attacked local officials and businesses for their problems and have asked Putin to intervene on their behalf. Should that change, Russia would enter a period of deep political crisis very fast.
Now, would you say that this is a type of shield that Putin is employing, essentially the power structure in the country, the capability of these regional centers to function to a certain degree in an autonomous way, that this also gives him the ability to deflect responsibility, right? Because if there is something going on at the local level, the anger will be directed against the local governor. And Putin, as you said, will be seen as the potential savior who might step in and save the day.
I think that's certainly been Putin's strategy. It tends to work better in predominantly ethnic Russian regions than in the non-Russian regions, where we are beginning to see the kind of political questioning of the leadership of the country and not just the republic. So yes, that's his strategy. Moreover, because he's spending so much of his time focusing on foreign policy and especially his war in Ukraine, non-Russian leaders who were in every case appointed by him are beginning to make calculations that they don't want to be blamed for everything. And that will lead, I think, to a linking up ultimately of the Republic leadership and the Republic populations. And also this will happen in the predominantly ethnic Russian oblasts and krais. And that too will be another step on the way to a disaster. And it's something that's a real pressure on Putin, although it's one he believes that he has sufficient police power to suppress for the time being.
So, speaking of suppression, you've already mentioned that many of these protests are not linked. Now, the authorities seem to know that, and they seem to be working really hard to prevent any sort of links from being formed within society in this regard. The control of the internet is intensifying. Some sites are being blocked altogether, even video games like Roblox, which could be used to communicate without supervision. Now, would you say that the introduction of the so-called whitelists, which are theoretically supposed to be a way of being able to access the mobile internet during shutdowns caused allegedly by Ukrainian drone activity, could this be a sign of an even more profound crackdown, resulting in Russia essentially being cut off from the outside world in terms of internet connections, and the government being able to control the internal communication between citizens to an even greater degree than today?
Absolutely. Closing down the internet has had a much bigger impact on the regions of Russia and on non-Russian areas than it has on Moscow. In Moscow, there are a variety of alternatives. There's a lot more sophistication and indeed higher incomes, so people can use VPNs and the like. But in the regions, this is clearly being done because Putin doesn't want any link up, doesn't want the kind of mobilization that the internet makes possible. And I would expect to see that crackdown continue. The tragedy for Russia, however, is that if it continues, it will also have a very negative impact on the ability of Russian businesses and even the Russian government to function. They're used to having access to the media, to the internet. Now they're not having it anymore. And what will happen is some people will try to find workarounds so they can ignore Moscow's restrictions, and those will politicize the issue still further. But you're absolutely right that this is an important sign in the direction Russia is moving toward more repression, not less, and toward something where the situation inside the country, which has gotten worse since Putin launched his expanded invasion of Ukraine in 2022, is going to continue, however much people are talking about peace in the West.
Now, isn't that something that we're kind of overlooking in the West? I mean, in our planning, in the approach that we're doing. During the Soviet era, there were tangible efforts made at disseminating information from the so-called outside world into the Soviet Union itself. Now, do we have the technological capability, perhaps, to offer some sort of alternative, like, when it comes to the lack of internet connection? You've mentioned VPNs, but the Roskomnadzor, the Russian government watchdog, is cracking down on these as well. But is there anything else that could be done, to reach out to ordinary people in Russia? Because we're often talking about, sanctions, reducing the capability of the Russian government to continue the war. This aspect has been somewhat less present in our discussions recently. At least that was my impression. What do you think?
Well, the West has the capability. It doesn't currently have the will. Instead of ramping up international broadcasting into the Russian Federation, we've cut back. Instead of figuring out new ways to deliver information via radio or direct-to-home satellite or direct-to-home radio broadcasting, all of which is technologically possible, the West has reduced that. And that gives Putin a greater leverage over his population. Were we doing anything like the level of broadcasting we did at the end of Soviet times, Mr. Putin would find it far more difficult to crack down on his own people in the way that he has.
Is it likely to change anytime soon? I mean, there are two power centers which theoretically could do that. One of them is the European Union, which naturally would have to overcome certain issues concerning the decision-making process, but perhaps also close a certain technological gap. The United States, according to the recently published security strategy, doesn't really want to assume the same role that it used to. It doesn't want to be the single dominant force in the world, certainly doesn't want to change regimes in countries such as Russia, at least according to what we know so far. Now, do you think that it might change if Russia proves, or if, Putin himself proves to be, if Putin chooses not to engage?
I certainly hope it will. Okay.
Yes.
I certainly hope it will change both in Europe and in the United States. The policy of making nice with Russia and pushing Europe aside and trying to break up the European Union, which some interpret the Trump's national security doctrine to call for, is so counter to American interests that I think there will be real pushback and resistance in the United States to it. How successful that will be, how soon it will have an impact, very much remains to be seen. We have enough people and we have enough structures that we could gin up more broadcasting and delivery to the peoples of the Russian Federation very, very quickly. The Europeans don't have nearly the capacity. There is some international broadcasting by the French, the Vatican, the Germans, but it is relatively small when compared to what the United States was doing. And so ginning it up would be hard. The other thing that's is worth noting is that the United States, during the Cold War and to a lesser extent since, was broadcasting not just to the ethnic Russians, but to a large number of other people, which Ukrainians, Armenians, Azerbaijanis, and so on. And that is a tradition the Europeans mostly don't have. So if they were to make an effort to communicate, they would have to start from a line far behind where the Americans could be immediately if a decision were made. It's going to be a tough slog. I think that more and more people are going to see that this war is going to drag on because Putin thinks he can keep winning if it drags on. And as that happens, I think there's a possibility that we could see some radical changes in Mr. Trump's policies and certainly in the policies of the American government writ large.
You've mentioned the Trump administration, but doesn't this actually go beyond this? Doesn't this actually touch upon this sort of fear that it has been present within the Western elites of Russia collapsing, potentially, of regime change, causing chaos, nuclear weapons falling into the wrong hands. Don't you think that at this stage, it is more comfortable for certain leaders to have the Russian opposition in exile, people who are making speeches, making certain, points which they can agree with? But if they were to extend their support to these forces, help them unify, now this is where the fear of the Russian collapse or a major wave of change would kick in. Why is this, something that's still present in our thinking to some extent?
Well, three quick points. First, before 1991, Western leaders took exactly the same position. The fear was that if the USSR came about, we would have loose nukes and we would have states fighting each other. Nonetheless, the Soviet Union came apart. We didn't have loose nukes for a whole variety of reasons. And it's been a remarkably peaceful partial imperial collapse. So we have a long precedent of not wanting change, but it happens anyway, and then we try to take credit for it. The second point I would make is that we have to begin to balance we have to compare two things. How much of a threat is a unified Russia as against a successor to the Russia that consists of a variety of states? None of the non-Russian countries that have emerged from the former Soviet Union is at odds with the West, is launching wars. Russia is. Why does anyone think that if Putin gets his way and absorbs some or all of these non-Russian areas, that he will be in a situation that he won't be making threats to the West to justify his own repression? And third, and this is the most important thing, even if the West doesn't support actively the disintegration of the Russian Federation, even if it believes, mistakenly, I think, that a unified Russia is less of a threat to our interests than a variety of new states, despite all the evidence to the contrary, the Russian Federation is going to disintegrate. It's going to continue to disintegrate. Is that going to happen today or tomorrow? Probably not. Is it going to happen within the next decade or so? Almost certainly. And it may happen when Putin goes, or it could even happen beforehand. Mr. Putin is very much out of touch with a lot of the issues that worry his own people. We're far more concerned about their jobs, their medical care, their education, all of which are in worse shape today than they were 5 years ago because of Putin's war. I think that there are Russian politicians who understand that, and I believe that there is a serious threat to the demise of the Russian Federation, even if the West doesn't do anything, even if it acts as if it's supporting Putin. The difference will be that many of the countries that emerged from the demise of the Soviet Union have acted in a pro-Western way because they believe they received at least some support from the West to achieve their nationhood. If the Russian Federation falls apart, as I believe it will, a lot of the pieces that come apart will be far less pro-Western than the current 14 non-Russian countries around the Russian Federation. And they will also believe, and this is something people had best think about, they will also believe that they cannot count on the West to protect them. And because that is so, they will have to take additional steps to protect themselves. And some of those additional steps might involve the acquisition or development of weapons that would be very, very threatening. We had a world which was relatively stable up until 2022, although there were cracks. Now that has been destroyed. There's no confidence that anyone is coming to anyone else's protection, and so you're going to see a lot more interest in having military power to defend yourself than was true in 1991. And that has consequences down the pipe, which it doesn't seem to me many in the West are focusing on, but they should be.
Paul Goebel was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your insight.
Thank you.
And for this episode of Eastern Express, it's the end of the line. Please stay with us here on TVP World for more latest news, updates and commentary.